guys, and welcome back to a new video. In this video today, we're going to learn about Proto DataStore in Android. What is DataStore? If you don't know that, it's basically shared preferences on steroids, you can say. So it is a way to save preferences in your app, but yeah, without having all the drawbacks shared preferences offers and DataStore preferences actually as well. So there are two different types of DataStore we have. On the one hand, DataStore preferences, which I already have a video about on my YouTube channel. And that's basically very similar to shared preferences, that you just store key value pairs of data. What we're dealing with here is Proto DataStore, which is a bit more complex to set up. But the big advantage is that it is type safe and you can store like whole Kotlin objects. And if you read them, you know there are no nullable values. You can only get values that you actually save there. So that's a big advantage. And what I will show you here explicitly is how you can use that together with Kotlinx serialization. So with a plugin from Kotlin to simply save your objects much more easily. So you don't need that special Protobuf language you would normally use for Proto DataStore. So that's what you're going to learn today. We're going to build something very simple here, just a simple language picker. As you can see, we can pick between 3 different languages. This won't do anything, won't change anything in the app here, just a setting that we will store. I will also show you how we can store more settings, of course, but we will keep the UI here very simple. And you can see when I pick something here, close the app, reopen this, then of course the setting is kept and loaded from Proto DataStore. So that's what we're going to build now. Let's actually jump into it and everything will be easy and I will explain it from absolute scratch. And for those who actually want to dive deeper into DataStore, I can really recommend the Medium articles from Simona Stojanovic. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Here she also wrote one about using it with Kotlin serialization, which I was inspired by, but she has a lot more cool articles if you scroll down. So you can see introduction, preference DataStore, Proto DataStore, dependency injection with that. So really cool stuff if you want to dive deeper into that topic and learn how everything works behind the scenes and not just on the surface, what we cover here. So definitely do check that out. I will hopefully remember linking that down in the description. So you will find these articles there. If not, you will just find them, of course, by Googling for her name. So back in Android Studio, we first of all need 3 dependencies here for our project. And that is on the one hand, of course, our DataStore dependency. So we have access to DataStore. We need the Kotlinx collections immutable dependency. That's not mandatory here in combination with DataStore. It's only mandatory if you actually want to save lists in DataStore, in Proto DataStore actually. Why that is the case, I will explain when we get to the point. And we need the Kotlinx serialization dependency to simply parse JSON data here. You need to make sure that you also include this plugin if you have that serialization in your project, and in your build.gradle project file, you need this class path. If you have that, you're good to go and ready to start with this. You'll find all the links, like all the class paths and dependencies in this video's description in my GitHub repository. Let's actually jump into it. And the first thing I want to do is I want to create a class that represents our actual preferences. So what I will do is I will go to our root package and create a new Kotlin class called app settings. So that's just an example here to show you how you would store app settings here. And that's a cool advantage here of Proto DataStore actually, that we use Kotlin data classes to define our preferences. So we could have different types of preferences. For example, one for user preferences, so only user specific data like username, whatever you want to save. One for your app settings, one for something else. And that really eliminates a lot of boilerplate code we would otherwise have if we just put the stuff here in simple data classes. So if you do that with shared preferences actually, then you need to create a wrapper class around that. And for every single field you want to save here, for example, in our app settings, you would need a function to that reads that field from shared preferences and writes a new value to that field. However, here with Proto DataStore, we just define a class and the whole class gets saved at once while still remaining type safety, which shared preferences did not offer. But before we actually fill in the constructor of this class, we want to define two more classes just as little helper classes here that we actually have the objects to save that. On the one hand, I want to have an enum class for our language we want to save. And for the sake of simplicity, I will just have 3 values here: English, German, and Spanish. And then we could save a language here. So a language of type language, and let's give it a default value of language English. So just to show you that we can also save enum values here, I want to show you that we can also save other data classes in this data class here, as long as these are serializable with the serialization plugin in Kotlin. So you could imagine, for example, having some kind of a list of known locations or so you want to save in your preferences. Like maybe you have a GPS app and your user can save like their home, their car location, whatever. Just very imagining here what you could use that for, just that I can show you how you could save a list. So we could have a data class location here, val, actually not double, val latitude, which is a double, and val longitude, which is a double. And then we could also just have that as a list here, known locations, for example, list of location, and we set it to an empty list by default. Now, we can't leave it like that. I will get to that in a moment. Before that, we actually want to make these classes serializable. So we annotate this with serializable. That will just tell the Kotlin serialization plugin, hey, that's a class we would actually like to parse to and from JSON or to some other kind of format. And since you can see we get an error here, since we use a non-serializable class in the serializable, which is why we also need to annotate this class with serializable. But let's get back to this known locations list. What's the issue with that? Well, this itself will work if you save that in a Proto DataStore here. However, it's not recommended to use mutable values here in your app settings. So on the one hand, a mutable value would be using var here, because Proto DataStore can detect these differences in your app settings class here. And that can really lead to some weird bugs if you have mutable values, not only in combination with Proto DataStore. In general, mutable values should be avoided as much as possible. Usually you can totally avoid these. So definitely don't do this. However, for the list, we have a val, but that could still be a mutable list. And this might be confusing or something new to some of you, because if we use such a normal list here and set it to an empty list, that itself is immutable. So there is no function to add an item here. We can't change items that are inside of this list. But why could this still be a mutable list here? Well, technically what we could do is we could simply set this to a mutable list of. And that would work because a mutable list is a subclass of this list class, and now we already have a mutable list. If we want to access this and add an item, then we would simply only need to cast this to a mutable list, and we could add items to this list. So it's not fully safe here. And the simple solution to this problem is that we use the lists. This Kotlin immutable list library actually provides this one here. And there we have something called, a persistent list. And here we can set this equal to a persistent list of. So what's the difference here? Here we actually have these add functions, remove. However, these don't do anything. So these just completely ignore what's in the list and won't actually mutate the list. If we want to mutate it, we could say .mutate. And then here we get a mutable list in which we could simply change the items. We won't spend too much time here with this list. I just wanted to show you how you could save a list, because that's something you might want to do in your preferences. It's not a very uncommon thing, but just that you see how this would work. In our app here, we will only store this language for the sake of simplicity. So what do we now need to do that we now have our app settings to actually save these in Proto DataStore? we need something called a serializer. So there we basically define how DataStore should save or parse what it reads and what it actually should write given an input stream or output stream. So let's actually create a new Kotlin class here for our app settings serializer. Make that an object. There's no reason for it to have multiple instances. And that will inherit from serializer from datastore.core. The type of that will simply be app settings. That's what we're going to serialize. And in here we can hit Control-I, Control-A to implement all these functions. The default value is just the initial value. Very simple. We can just initialize our app settings as it is with our default values here for language and persistent list. Then read from. So here we get an input stream and we now need to define how we read from this input stream. And you can already see these are suspend functions. That's also a cool thing of DataStore that it now uses Kotlin coroutines. So it's a Kotlin library, which is pretty cool. So you could also use other suspend functions in here. And what I will do here is I will simply return a try and catch block so we can easily catch exceptions, serialization exceptions. And if we catch an exception here, I won't do any special stuff. Let's just print it. And we then return our default value. Oops, what did I do? Close these. And I want the default value, this one. And in the try block, what we will do is we will use our Kotlinx serialization plugin now to actually parse this input from JSON to our app settings object that we need to return here. So we use JSON, dot decode from string. And here we need to provide our deserializer, which is our app settings object, so our data class. That serializer, that exists because we annotated it with serializable, so the plugin generated that function. And the string we actually want to deserialize here is our input read bytes decode to string. And that's already it for this read from function. Now we can scroll down to write to, which is even simpler. So here we can just say, okay, we actually have our output and we want to write to that output stream. And what do we want to write? Well, we need to pass a byte array here, which we can simply get using JSON again. JSON, this time we want to encode to a string. And yeah, the serializer is again our app settings serializer. And the value, so the object we want to serialize, is given here as a parameter. So our app settings object, of course. And then we can say dot encode to byte array. And yeah, we get a warning here because Android Studio is not smart enough to recognize that this is actually going to be executed asynchronously in a coroutine. It says, hey, this is actually a blocking method call. So we can hit Alt-Enter and remove this warning here by adding this annotation to our serializer here. That's just optional to get rid of a warning. Cool, so now we have that serializer. So next up we can create our DataStore instance, which we can then use to read and write from and to DataStore. Let's do this here in main activity. The typical way to do this is that you create an extension of the context object of the context class, just like this. So we have a val context. We can call DataStore on that. And then we say by DataStore. And here we need to provide a file name. So how we call this file where we save our app settings, I'll call it app settings.json. And the serializer here will now be our, no Siri. The serializer will now be our app settings serializer. So that's how we just get a reference to our DataStore object given a context. So we can actually get that in an activity, in a composable, wherever. So for example, here in onCreate, we could just say DataStore and we get a reference to that. We can either update our data or read that data that we have. Let's actually have a simple function here to update that data. just make that a private suspend function actually. Let's say we call it set language, and here we can save a new language in our DataStore instance. So we can say, okay, we use DataStore, update data, and here you can see we get an app settings object now, and that is type safe. So if no values are nullable here in our app settings object, then we can be sure that this object will also not have nullable values, and all these types are safe. There are no parsing errors. And here we simply say it.copy. So we now need to return a new app settings object that contains the changes we actually want, and the language would then be our new language. And as I said, if you would also like to update the known locations, you would need to do it like this. So you would say it known locations.mutate. And here you then get a reference to this as a mutable list, where you can say, okay, I actually want to add a new item, like a new location. But let's not do this, and let's focus on just the language. Let's do it like this. There we go. And now what's missing is we actually want to have our radio buttons. And when we click the radio buttons, we want to update that in our data store. We want to ideally observe the app settings object as a compose state from a data store, which is possible, which is cool, which shared preferences does not offer. So in data store, whenever the preferences change, our state is automatically updated and keeps our UI up to date. And the way this works is we can just get an app settings object here using our data store. And you can see we can refer to the data, which is now a flow. So if we have a flow, you might already know that, we can call collect as state. And we need to provide an initial state here, which I would just use the default settings for. And then we get this app settings object as state. And whenever that changes, then we update it, which is pretty cool. And what we need here is a coroutine scope, because we would also like to save something in data store. And as you see, that's a suspend function to do that. And for that, we need a coroutine scope, which we can get with remember coroutine scope. Let's just quickly write our UI, which is really not the focus, but also not very long and difficult here. We just have a column of 3 radio buttons. Let's make this fill our whole screen. Let's center it vertically and horizontally. And inside of this column, we will simply have a row of radio buttons. A row because we would like to have a button and a text. Yeah, let's also say we have vertical alignment set to center. And then we simply have our radio button. Well, when is this radio button selected? Please let me format that. Okay. Well, this is actually selected if our language that our app settings object contains is actually the language this radio button represents. So first of all, we need a way to actually have 3 radio buttons, which you can simply do with a for loop. So for I in 0 to 2, that's how many languages we have. We have 3 languages. We would like to have a row, like 3 rows in total. And we can get the current language, like for this specific radio button, by using our language enum class. We can say that values, which gives us an array of all of our languages. So just in the right order, we have English, German, and Spanish. And we want to give it, we want to get it at the index I. That's the current language for this radio button. And then we can just check, okay, it should be selected if this language is actually the language from our app settings object. So whatever we save there in app settings. And when we then click on this radio button, so when we select it, then we want to actually launch a coroutine in our scope that we got. And then we call our set language function to set a new language. Which language do we want to set now, or we want to save to data store? Well, that's the language this radio button represents. And that should be it. No, we actually still need a text. So let's have a little bit of spacing here with a width of 8 dp. Import dp, and let's have our text. And the text just represents our language.toString. And that should be everything that we need to do. If we launch this, then we can try this out. Okay, you can see English is selected by default. If we click on German, then we select this, Spanish. So that just works fine. And if we close this, German was selected, and go back to, which one is it? This one? No, that was the other one. Spanish was selected. So this one. Yeah, German is selected. So everything is working fine. That is now saved persistently in a file somewhere on our Android device. But most importantly, we have a type-safe way of actually storing our data, which eliminates a lot of boilerplate code we had with shared preferences. We also had with data store preferences, even though they were a little bit more simple when it came to quickly implementing that. But once you have the setup for Proto DataStore, it's also really easy to use, and you have all these advantages. So for scaling projects, I can really recommend using this. I will also use it in future. So yeah. Hope you liked this video. If you are actually new to Kotlin coroutines and you want to use all the data store stuff which requires that, then there are actually 5 very common mistakes I see over and over again. To prevent these, simply watch this video next, and you're good to go.